Hi, everyone. Today's lecture is going to be a pretty complicated one. We're going to focus on 4 episodes, really. We're going to focus on episode 7, The Face of Depression, episode 9, which is the premiere of the second half, 6B, Intermediate Scene Study with Bojack Horseman, episode 10, which is Good Damage, the episode about Diane's writer's block, and also episode 12, Xerox of a Xerox. We'll talk about that one a little bit too, where Bojack gives the interviews towards the end of the series. We are going to weave those 4 episodes together. We're going to introduce the notion of performative identity, which is a new kind of identity to contrast with the types that we were talking about last time. We're also going to return to our discussion of narrative identity, and we're going to spend some time talking about depression and the effects of depression on identity. So performative identity, more about narrative identity, and depression and its relationship to identity are really our topics for this lecture. I want to begin at the start of season 6B, which is at the start of episode 9. Here we see Bojack practicing introducing himself to his students in his new role as a professor over and over again. He keeps reiterating his opening line, and it really seems like what he's doing is practicing his lines the way any actor would practice their lines. But of course, these are not lines in a play, these are lines in his real life. And what does he tell his students? He practices telling them that, and this is his words, quote, acting is leaving everything behind and becoming something completely new, unquote. Acting is leaving everything behind and becoming something completely new. Right after that opening scene, within the first few minutes of that first episode of 6B, we also see Hollyhock reading for her class Judith Butler's book, Gender Trouble, which I assigned you part of. All of these things are going to tie together. But let's start by thinking about Bojack's claim about acting. He says that acting is leaving everything behind and becoming something completely new. Normally, of course, we think of acting as kind of the opposite of this, right? We think about acting as putting a fake self on top of your real self, right? Performing a fake self, which is different from the self inside. We don't think of it as literally dumping your old self and becoming a new self. So it's really interesting that this is how Bojack is framing acting, right? He's suggesting here that by acting out a new self, you actually get a new self. And this is a substantive thesis that we need to think about, right? We see him practicing his new self in the most literal sense. Now, when he's practicing his lines, practicing to be this new self, whether what he's doing is practicing covering over his old self or practicing leaving his old self behind and starting a new self, well, that's on the one hand the 2 different conceptions of acting, but on the other hand, that's the same dilemma that we've been talking about for this whole season, right? In all of the lectures so far, I've talked about that dilemma. Is he leaving the old self behind and creating something new, or is he covering over his old self with a performed something new? Which is it? Which it is depends partly on whether Judith Butler, who Hollyhock is reading, is right in what she says about identity. Right? So when we ask how could acting be the creation of a new self rather than just the covering over of the old self, we need to look at Butler's performative theory of identity. This is a new understanding of identity to add to our list. Now she focuses on gender identity and gender identity as a performed identity, but really what she says applies, even according to her in the rest of her work, to all important socially salient parts of our identity, not just our gender, but our race, our personality, our identity as a mother or as a brother or whatever it might be. And here we're applying it to Bojack's new identity as a professor, as an academic. Right? So what's the idea of the performative theory of identity? The idea is our society is filled with norms and patterns and rituals that mark how we're supposed to express an identity, and they let other people know what that identity is supposed to be. And when you perform these rituals of identity, other people give you uptake. They can understand which rituals you're performing, and so they understand what identity you're expressing, and they respond to you as having that identity. And here's the key. According to Butler, the performance of these kinds of social rituals and getting uptake as having performed those social rituals just is the identity. The identity is nothing beyond the performance. So in the case of gender, which is the one that she focuses on, right, having a feminine identity or being a woman just is doing the social rituals that go along with being a woman. So using the women's bathroom instead of the men's bathroom, shaving your legs, speaking with a certain inflection to your voice, whatever it may be, all of those social rituals that make up femininity, performing those, plus being recognized by other people as performing them and being responded to it by other people as having that identity, just is what it is to have the identity. In the case of a professorial identity, like Bojack is trying to bridge, being a professor is a matter of performing the professor identity, right? Standing in front of your class, sounding authoritative, grading papers, maybe wearing certain kinds of academic outfits, all things that we see Bojack actively practicing. And whether you succeed in having that identity just is a matter of whether you are performing the social role properly and receiving uptake from other people as performing that social role. So the fact that his students call him horse professor and love having him as a teacher and take him seriously is part of what solidifies him as actually having that identity rather than just trying to have that identity. Now, by now you guys know enough about existentialism, I hope, to be able to recognize right off the bat that this is a deeply existentialist view of identity, because it lets identity be a matter of what you do and what you perform rather than what you are somehow on the inside that then gets expressed or not in your actions. The twist from other kinds of existentialism that we've looked at is that now your identity is not just what you do, it's what you do in a way that gets its meaning and its reality from how it iterates or repeats or draws upon past social performances of the same sort, right? So all existentialists say you are what you do. Judith Butler's performative theory of identity is a kind of existentialism that says you are what you do insofar as what you do is a kind of a repetition or an iteration of a social ritual that other people who share an identity with you have done. I'm not sure that sentence made sense grammatically, but I take it you get the point, right? So other people's uptake of what we do and the whole past history of multiple social iterations of doing that all together help solidify the identity that we have. And there is no real true self underneath that social performance. The way that Butler puts this is to say that identity is always iterative. It always takes its meaning from past performances. But she also thinks that identity is always creative. So we're not just simply mimicking or recreating the past performances. It won't be a full-blooded identity if all we do is exactly copy what other people have done. We always bring our own little creative touch to it, or our own riff to it. We recontextualize it. We give it a new form or a new meaning. But the way that we're doing it is still a version of what other people have done. Right? So it's not a kind of determinism that says that the only way you can be a woman is if you perform identity exactly the way that everybody else has always performed femininity. Sorry, I said that wrong. The only way you can be a woman is by performing femininity exactly the way everybody else has performed femininity. That doesn't work, partly because not everybody performs femininity the same way. Right? And likewise, it's not like you can only be a professor by being exactly the same kind of performance of a professor as every other professor has ever performed. You can bring some creativity to the performance, but it still gets its meaning from being some kind of iteration or repetition or riff on all of those other performances of femininity or all of those other performances of being a professor. And the mark of whether you're succeeding is whether the other people around you participate in that performance with you, give you uptake as having that identity. And this is what Bojack is practicing to do, right? Now, does the show believe that Judith Butler is right? Does the show believe in performative identity? As always, I'm going to say the same thing I always say, it's ambiguous, right? The show takes both views. It both puts forward the performative theory of our identity and makes it appealing to us in various ways, and it also at other points casts doubt on it, right? So just one cute example of this, at the very same time, at that very beginning of 6B, the very same time as he's practicing his line over and over again about how you can become something completely new by performing a new identity, right? At that very moment, he writes his own name by mistake on the board in indelible ink that can't be erased. So at the same time as he's saying you can shed your past and turn into a new thing, he does this little act which is going to make his past never go away. And for the whole rest of the season, his name is written there unchangeably on the board, stuck in time. Right? It's a beautiful metaphor for the idea that no, you can't completely shed your past. Your past has a solidity to it and is going to tie you down and haunt you no matter how much you perform having shed it. Later, notice once he is on the hook for Sarah Lynn's death, the whiteboard is going to have Sarah Lynn's name written on it in exactly the same way as Bojack's name is written on the first whiteboard, right? So her name written in the middle of the board stands for the way that the past locks you in this powerful way. So on the one hand, the show seems to be giving us a version of Bojack who manages to forge a genuinely new identity by performing it, right? Acting as leaving things behind and becoming something new. And at the same time, it's telling us the past keeps reemerging. The past can't be gotten rid of. The past is locking you down. The past is at least as real as the present. When Bojack gives the interview, he takes this on directly, right? The first interview, the one that goes well, as opposed to the second disastrous interview. He says to the interviewer, I used to think of my whole life as an acting job, doing an impression of the people who I saw on television. I felt like a Xerox of a person. That's kind of the cynical version of the performative theory of identity, right? The cynical version of that is that all we are is copies of other people and that we can never be anything authentic. I think that quote really does summarize the existential shape of the show across all its seasons. We saw him do this. We saw him trying to learn to be someone specifically by watching performances on TV and then trying to perform having that kind of a selfhood. We looked at this a lot, how he learns how to be a person through TV shows, right? So his identity up until now has in many ways been a performance of a performance, which is exactly what Butler says, except here he's portraying that not as a successful way of forging an identity, but as a hollow way of forging an identity. And then he claims in the interview, now I feel like me. So the implication is that now he has stopped being a performance of a performance and he's a real self. But that's kind of a paradoxical claim for him to make, since we see him throughout this whole season 6 trying on a different performance. He's not simply in touch with his authentic inner self now. He's just performing differently. And then the interviewer asks him directly, this person I'm describing, speaking about his past self who was a drunk who hurt people, is it a different person or is it you? And this is the question that Bojack's gone back and forth on for the whole season. But in that moment, he says, yeah, it's me. Right? At that moment, he takes responsibility for his past self, and he doesn't disown it. Ironically, we find out in the next episode that him calling himself a Xerox of a Xerox, this kind of moment of existential truth where he sees through the hollowness of his past self, which should be this great redeeming moment, That phrase is the very phrase that makes him get sued for $100 million, right? Because he used the word Xerox and the Xerox company doesn't like it. So this moment of existential truth is ultimately the one that destroys him, right? The money doesn't matter to him that much, but it's because he gets sued that he ends up losing his house and he ends up losing his place in horsing around, the two things that most anchored him over the years and were most identified with him. He also gets the letter losing Hollyhock at the same moment. So him calling himself a Xerox of a Xerox, which seems like this great redemptive moment, in many ways ends up being his downfall. It ends up taking away from him the things that he's most identified with. And the phrase Xerox of a Xerox is such a fascinating phrase, right? Because we don't know if it's describing what we're all condemned to, that we're all just condemned to be performances of other performances, or if it's describing a bad faith way of existence that we can move past. Okay, this chunk is getting long, so I'm going to stop here and keep going.